I'm Bill Powers. I'm the current president-elect of the Pittsford Historical Society again. So I want to welcome you all to Pittsford. And we have a number of the members of the Pittsford Historical Society here and members of the Congregational Church, and they have prepared the facilities for you, and we're glad to have you here. I'm going to pick up on a theme that's been going on the Crown Point Road here in the last year or so, as trips along the Crown Point Road visiting taverns, inns, public houses, or whatever. So I'm going to talk about two, quote, watering holes today. The second item will be definitely a watering hole. And the first one is going to be about a tavern here in Pittsford that was near the Crown Point Road. Now, as I go along, if you have any questions or comments, I'd be glad to hear them, because I didn't put this presentation just to have it sit on my computer, but I'm always interested in the amount of detail that I can find on certain historical sites, and you'll get a flavor for that. I may put you to sleep on part of it, but this will kind of pique your interest, I hope. Well, we all know that the Crown Point Road went from Fort Number 4 up to Chimney Point, and so there you got the map of it. Once it gets to Clarendon, it crosses Otter Creek and basically follows the west side of Otter Creek all the way to Crown Point or Chimney Point. I mean, there are variations documented in the Crown Point Road book, but basically I think it stayed on the west side of Otter Creek. You got two red dots up there, and those are the areas I'm going to be talking about today, the location. And the red dot on the bottom is the site of the Waters Tavern, and then the dot up there by the D and Road is going to be a spring, which is at the base of current Miller Hill, and was known to be along the Crown Point Road back in at least the 1700s. I want to acknowledge the two of those ladies who helped found the Crown Point Road Association, because they published a lot of their findings in newspapers and other documentation, and you're going to see some of what they had to say as I go along. The Waters Tavern in Pittsford. Flora Week says that I'm not sure where Sanford Phillips lived, but she talks about the road turning westerly up the hill, then northerly, westerly to the hill back of the present residence of Abel Brown, just east of whose house was the tavern of Sammy Waters, built before 1774. Well, we know where Abel Brown lived, and I question the site of the road she mentions here, because if you go up behind a road, if you go up a hill behind Abel Brown's house, you're going up what we call Fire Hill here in Pittsford, and it doesn't jibe with other routes on that have been identified on the Crown Point Road. But nevertheless, we're going to talk about the tavern. For those of you who may not be familiar, but Dr. Cavalier wrote the history of the town of Pittsford in 1872. And the significant thing about his history is, before he wrote it, he sent out a questionnaire to all the locals. And from that, he could develop his history, particularly about the biographies of the people that lived in the Pittsford area and other stuff. He also had access to military records or whatever was available at the state archives. And the questionnaires that he sent out, the responses there too, are still resident in the Pittsford Historical Society. So they're pretty helpful. So when he talks about Samuel Waters, came to Pittsford from the Dutchess County, New York. And of course, he bought all this land here, and he didn't settle here to 1772. The important thing is the house which he built stood near the southeast corner of what is now Mr. Morgan's orchard, and near the Crown Point Road. And we'll go through that. And by 1772, there's only a cavity marking the spot where that tavern was. But we'll see if we can track it down here.
Bill, I have a question. Were his patents New Hampshire patents, New York patents, do you know?
I can't hear you.
Were they New Hampshire patents, New York patents?
No, this was New Hampshire patent. And okay, here's another mention of it by Flora Weeks, and it talks about a 1802 Massachusetts registered calendar, which identifies the Crown Point Road, and we're going to take a look at that. That 1802 reference acknowledges Bickerstaff's, it's Bickerstaff's actually, Boston Almanac of 1774. And here's, I've cropped this a little bit because this page was too far down. But this is used as a reference point for a lot of the subsequent publications of where the Crown Point Road went. And you can see here from Charlestown, because you can't see the top of the right-hand column there, talks about Charlestown, and then it lists below there all the places that were significant along the road, at least in the 1770s. And down there you can see, once you go from Mead's Tavern, where most of us know where that is in Center Rutland, it goes up to the Waters Place here in Pittsford. So here's, H.P. Smith in his 1886 History of Addison County talks about the road, and again, it's quoting the Bickerstaff's route, just that we saw there, and then down there in highlighted red, it goes to Waters Tavern, and then to Brown's Camp in Neshabie. We're going to get to Brown's Camp because the spring that I'm talking about was at it's actually in Sudbury, and that's Brown's Camp was on top of the spring. Now, there's a short story on the tavern here in Pittsford. We know it was in operation in 1774 because Waters was settled here. But when Burgoyne came through on his way to Saratoga, a lot of the people left here, and Waters was one of them. And he went down to Shaftesbury and stayed there, and that's where he and his wife are buried. Here's a 1783 map that can be found in the back of Calverley's History of Pittsford. But this shows where Samuel Waters had his land. Over here, you've got Otter Creek. This would have been the route of the Crown Point Road. This is the West Creek Road of the Florence section of Pittsford. And we'll go to the next map. It will show Morgan is on the spot where Waters owned property. And this is on the Whipple Hollow Road that comes in and joins the West Creek Road over here. And we know that Mead's Tavern was also on the south end of the Whipple Hollow Road. So now that we know where Morgan is, we move on to today's Google map. And to make a very long story short, Morgan built his house here, and then his daughter married William Brown, and then William Brown and Hattie Morgan had Abel Brown, and so we know Morgan lived till 1900, Abel Brown lived to 1986. And when Cammerly talks about the tavern being east of an orchard, well, the question is, where was the orchard? And there's nobody around here that knows exactly where the orchard is. But based on this land over here, it's flat over here, but that's to the west. This is east, and all this is wonderful pasture or good land to grow crops, that maybe the orchard was up here. And we figure that maybe the tavern was in this area here. But we'll see this again. And there's Abel Morgan's house. Now I got 3 different shots of this house, but there's no time on when the pictures were taken. So we're going to either see Abel Morgan, William Brown, or Abel Brown in these pictures. And it just so happens that Liz Willis happens to be the daughter of Barb Willis, who's with us today. And Barb is the vice president of the Pittsford Historical Society. So it's a small group here that's got to focus on a lot of the history here. So this is and Liz bought this property, I forget how long ago.
Maybe 5 years ago.
5 or 6 years ago, okay, yeah. And here's another shot of it. What I'd really like to find is a panoramic view of somebody stepping back about this time to see if we could see the orchard. And here's another shot here. It's hard to tell which photograph is older than when, but they're all about the same period of time. So that's Abel Morgan's and Abel Brown's house. And that's what it looked like in 1972. So it might be that the orchard was over here, but this way, off to the right is the east. And that's Liz's house last Christmas. This is on Facebook. So no doubt the tavern is over here somewhere. And from 1885, everybody knew about the tavern, and this was known as the first, quote, public house in town. For those of you who may not know, all the Vermont newspapers that have been digitized can be found on the Secretary of State of Vermont's website. If you're a Vermonter or live in Vermont, you can go in, establish an account on that website. It doesn't cost anything, and you can go in and then search all the newspapers that have been digitized. It's a tremendous resource. And they seem to be updating it every now and then with additional newspapers. And this has only been in existence for a couple of years now. It took me a year to figure out how to use it properly without fumbling around, but anyway. So here's another mention of the first hotel, and in 1886, and they were talking about the history of thing, and they say that's the first public house, and then a public house after the war where the monument now stands near Dickerman's. And that's talking about the monument on the site of Fort Vengeance, which is the resting place of Caleb Houghton, who was killed by an Indian a half mile south of that monument in 1780. Then it talks about the other houses or inns. Otter Creek House is where, well, it's just across the street here where Commuta's country store is now. So this is kind of a summary. Just saw this slide. So about here, there's a depression in the ground. There is kind of a cutout here, so this is where we figure that the tavern might have been until somebody smarter than some of us can figure that out. And so that's where we think the tavern was. Are there any questions? I think this is the last slide for this portion. Okay. Brown's Camp in Sudbury, Vermont. At the base of the Brown's Camp refers to Silas Brown, who came from Sudbury, Massachusetts to settle the land known as Sudbury, Vermont today. And at the base of his camp, if you will, there's a spring, and it's referred to as the Cold Continental Schooner or Ormsby Spring. And I'll show you some reasons why it's called that. Now you have to be very careful when you read about Brown's Camp, because different sources cite it being in different places. It has always been in Sudbury. Some say it was in Neshabie, and that was the original name of the town of Brandon, as it was established in 1761, but the town of Neshabie changed its name to Brandon in 1784. And this is located also close to the Whiting town lines, but the correct thing is Brown's Camp has been in Sudbury. Here's an aerial map today. You take Route 73 west out of Brandon. You go over Otter Creek right here. You go down to the intersection of Willowbrook Road. And I know some of you were on the Willowbrook Road hike that Jim Rowe had here a couple years ago, which is down south. And that road, that hike takes you on what might have been the Crown Point Road, going off to the east or off to the west, south of this, but there may be a modification of that, as you see here. But so the next slide I'll show you, that's where the spring was. The Brown's Camp was up here, and former Miller covered bridge went this way. And later on in the 50s, the road was changed so it goes over here. So any question about the location that we're talking about? Okay. All right, Smith talks about, you've already seen this, so that we know that the Crown Point Road went from Waters Tavern to Brown's Camp, and that's where we are now. And from there they went on to Moore's Tavern and Shore. Again, we've just gone, there's Waters, and we saw that before. There's Miller Covered Bridge. This is looking east. This was built in the 1800s, and it's south of where the bridge now, where the road crosses Otter Creek. This is looking west, and here's another shot. Here's Miller Hill in the background, and the spring we're talking about is over in here on the west bank of Otter Creek. So this just says here It says that the Miller Bridge was 125 years old when it was disassembled in 1953. So that would have been a big deal back in the day. Now, here's an issue. In trying to determine the facts about Brown's Camp, I tried this a number of years ago, and there weren't any deeds available at that early time in the town of Sudbury. And like many towns, even Brandon, Pittsford, some early deeds, very early deeds have either been lost or destroyed. There's an exception in Sudbury. Somebody decided to peddle the Sudbury's proprietor's book in the 1800s, and here's an ad from Rare Books in Boston peddling Sudbury's original records. Well, the good news is that the New York Historical Society in Manhattan purchased the book. And as I understand it, that was microfilmed. And Phyllis Humphreys had that microfilm. And about 30 years, Steve Scorbati, who was the town clerk in Sudbury, transcribed a lot of what was on that microfilm. And so we were able to get information about which Brown it was that had the camp on the ledge above the spring along Otter Creek. And it goes on and talks about the early settlement. There were a number of Browns, but Silas was the man who orchestrated the settlement of Sudbury, Vermont, as he's from Sudbury, Massachusetts. And you can see that he's Captain Brown. He got paid for doing all his work, and that he's here as early as 1764, even though he may not have settled here for another 8 years or so. Now here's this map that is associated with the proprietor's book, and it shows the Crown Point Road in red, and then the Ticonderoga Road, which Route 73 follows today, goes up the hill towards Ticonderoga. And I forget my next chart, but the spring is right in, I'll be right in here. Here are some other maps that talks about Brown's Camp. It's pretty close, same area. There's another, this Brown's Camp in 1796. And later on, we get to 1854, that Paul Spooner had a farm here, and this is where Miller Bridge would have been, right here, and the spring would be right in there about that junction. I don't think this is completely accurate, but it's close enough to put us in the ballpark. Here's Wallen's map of 1860, and Brown's Camp seems to have moved a little bit up here. And that 1860 map, I put a picture of spring at Brown's Camp, and then you've got the Elias Hall Spring up here at Stony Spring, up there in Whiting, is it? So the point here is that this spring has been well known for a long period of time. And right now we're in the late 17 and early 1800s. There's the spring again. It's now Spooner property. Again, we're talking about Palmore Shore being pursued by the Indians, and it talks about him concealing himself, and then he's traveling along and he goes through the snow, went to the safety of Brown's Camp. This is all happening during the revolution around 1768. And near Miller's Bridge, and which is a high spring. So all the facts come together here. Another guy, Elihu Marshall, is also coming from a place called Walker's Hill. And I don't know, is Walker's tavern stand, is anybody familiar with that? I'm not familiar with that. But anyway, he talks about coming down here, using the ice as Otter Creek as a highway. Again, these are Brown camps, at Brown's Camp near Miller's Bridge, which was on the military road leading from Ticonderoga. And Smith again, and his history of Addison County, addresses the old military road, et cetera, et cetera. And again, you'll notice it cites that old Bickerstiff's account of all the different places that the Crown Point Road went, and then through Brown's Camp. Here's another version of Smith's history of Rutland County, and it cites the same, basically the same thing over and over. Now, the best historian of the 19th century, Abby Hemingway, talks about Brown's Camp, high on a rock, in which the spring issues. You know, if Abby says it, she's pretty accurate. She's pretty good writer. But Brown's Camp was known in the during the Revolutionary War time, and this is so this is important because it takes us back to a site that must have been pretty active. And we don't have to go through a lot of detail here, but the next 4 to 6 slides that I've got are from Revolutionary War pension records. And these are firsthand accounts of guys who were at Brown's Camp and at the spring. And so there was this one here, this was this, Simon Wright talks about a expedition that went after the British Indians and Tories who had come to Brandon, Pittsford area, and burned a number of the houses of the settlers. And they pursued the enemy from the south here, and they got as far as Brown's Camp, and then they stopped. And from what I've read, the troops that were called out to do that, to chase, were very upset with Lieutenant Colonel James Claghorn for not pursuing them further. And from then on, they referred to him as Granny Claghorn. He was one of those fellas. Silas Pratt from Rutland, he was also there, marched under Claghorn as far as the camp. Richard Haskins, I think he was from Pulteney. If I remember correctly, he's the one that viewed the Battle of Hubbardton from probably the ridge over there. But again, he was part of that crowd. Shrill Elworth was there, and he remembered all these things, particularly based on what happened in the Revolutionary War. John Bishop Jr. actually joined the war effort at Brown's Camp. And see, he calls it the town of Whiting, so. But we're all talking about the same area. So there's the documentation from the 18th century. So in a 1986 Crown Point Road hike, the Crown Point folks took a walk to with Al Ransom to that was now called the Ormsby Spring at the foot of Miller Hill, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, Ebenezer Ormsby, born in 1834, and he became a lawyer, and then he was a governor. He was a representative out in the Solomon Islands, I think. I may have that wrong, but he was out in the Pacific for a period of time. And then he came back to Brandon, continued his law practice. He got to the exalted position of the assistant town clerk, but that's for another presentation. But he lived up at what is called the Arnold District in Brandon. And that's the west portion of Brandon, borders Otter Creek. And he had the habit of riding his horse from the Arnold District out to the spring to, quote, really water his horse. And so to commemorate that, notice that he passes away in 1924. So in the 1880s, this was, spring was acknowledged, and the side of the ledge there said, "This is Governor Ormsby's cup. Take a drink and hang it up." And you can see the cup hanging up here. Well, later on, they decided to put up a fancier memorial. So there was a marble and bronze plaque mounted on that, above that spring. And this happened in 1932. Say the same phrase I just mentioned. Stop and drink. And his daughter was there at the commemoration. And it talks about that picture I just showed you. Originally, the face of the governor was carved in the 1880s on a rock, blah, blah, blah. And then his daughter says it was almost impossible to keep the cup at the spring for any length of time, but because the cup continued to disappear. So, I'll explain how this is created, but this is the excuse me, this is the actual bronze plaque and marble plaque that it was installed on, and it's been digitally mounted on the spring. There's another imagined view. I don't think the bottom of it looked like this, but we wanted to have something to line up all the holes to show you how big it was. And you'll notice that some, over time, have boxed in with stone with the actual spring. So what happens was that the plaque that was put up there had been injured by ice and everything else, so they had to put it back up in 1942. And this was all done by the American Legion. And so this is the newspaper reporting that 1942 that it was put back up. But by 1958, it appears it had disappeared again. So, because this is another mention of it. And I think this was the first time I saw it mentioned as the Continental Spring. Whoops. but the Crown Point Road was on the spot again in 58. This is what the spring looked like in 2010. And the plaque still exists. And if you look hard, if you drive north on Route 7 to Brandon, on the right-hand side, just south of Brandon, you know where the American Legion is. If you look where the flagpole is in front of the American Legion, and you look behind the flagpole and just in front of the building, you see a thing that looks like a gravestone. And that's what this is. So that the plaque was put up and removed by the American Legion and now sits behind the flagpole and in front of the American Legion in Brandon. A couple months ago, I went and I took the picture. This is the picture of the original hook on which the cup rested above the, well, it was before the plaque. Here's the two holes that line up with the upper portions of the plaque. That's a close-up of the original hook. And there's the upper left portion of where the support was for the plaque. And that's what the spring looked like in July of this year. Still bubbling away, in spite of the drought. And that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions? Oh, you're all asleep? Well, thank you very much. So, Jim.
The Crown Point Road obviously passed west of that site.
Can't hear you. It's not your mask, it's my ears.
The Crown Point Road obviously passed west of there, right?
Well, that's,
Can you hear me?
yeah, I hear you. I don't know as I agree with you. According to that map, it doesn't. It doesn't go west of the spring, it goes north of the spring and then heads west.
Well, one of the suspected cattle pen sites is right in that general area also.
Would that be up on top of
Yeah.
where Brown's Camp is?
Spooner Hill area.
Yeah,
But nothing can ever be proved that it was there, because that whole area has been so heavily disturbed by the stone quarries there.
yes.
Even Brown's Camp, I mean, you know, we've often thought about going in there and seeing if there's any remnants of that left there, because as you say, for, I think there's like a 30 or 40 year period, it shows up on maps, starting with early settlement of Sudbury and right up through. And there was definitely something there. It's referenced many times, as you said, but that's all we'll let them know about it.
Yeah, it just, there's no question the Crown Point Road went near there.
Yeah.
If the spring has been there, if it's God put it there,
Yeah.
and it was known forever, it would make sense that the Crown Point Road at least got to the spring.
Yeah.
And then you got all that hill to the left of you, and it kind of flattens out when you go into Whiting,
Yeah.
and it goes over to whatever the name of that other spring is. So, just one of those quandaries, but.
But there was quite a bit going on in that area, regardless.
Yeah, and well, if you go up Miller Hill, the farm on the right has had an archaeological dig out in there, on the hillside there. So it was a significant place. And I think if you go up, continue on Route 73 west up Miller Hill, and there's another spring up there near that old school up there, the stone school.
Yeah.
So just a very interesting spot. And now let me ask you a question. Do you know anything about that microfilm that Phyllis Humphreys had? Have you ever heard anything what happened to that?
I've never seen it, only other than what Steve Scabatti has come up with.
Yeah,
But I know the New York State Library had it in New York City. And thankfully, we do have copies of that.
Yeah, it would be nice to see what else is on there, because I know there's got to be some deeds on there. And that would fill in a gap of the early deed history,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, I've never seen anything show up in any of Phyllis's stuff. And I wish she was still with us today, because we've answered a lot of questions.
Okay,
Thanks, Bill.
okay. Anything else? Tom?
Bill, do you think there was a difference in taste between the spring and the nearby Otter Creek? Because one is a small
I'm
body of
having
water,
trouble,
one's a
again,
huge body of water.
Tom, I'm having trouble hearing.
Do you think there was a great difference in taste between the little tiny spring and the great big Otter Creek nearby?
Was there a difference in what?
Taste, T-A-S-T-E.
Yeah, I'd rather drink out of the spring than I would out of the Otter Creek, that's for sure.
Even today, you saw it this summer.
Well, you can't, now, one of the reasons that the plaque was taken down and the cup was taken away in the 40s because of pollution.
Sure.
And it's right next to the road. The pictures don't show it, but it's just a step from the road to the middle of the spring. Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't drink out of the spring today. I know that Phil Marks used to cool his beer there back in the 60s, but that's about all it's good for. But it sure is flowing, and you can tell there's been a lot of work done to keep it flowing. And I think there's even a pipe that lets it drain under the road into Otter Creek.
I'll just also add, Bill, that I remember seeing a picture of, I think it's one of Elaine Purdy's brothers, standing beside that spring, the marble slabs and the plaque. Now, I don't know if that would have been at the dedication of that in the 30s or not, but he was just a little boy then.
Oh, that'd be a cool picture to
Yeah.
add to this.
Probably a question for Elaine if she
Yeah,
with it.
that's cool. Well, I thought about trying to chase down that microfilm and all the other stuff, but, I have other roads I follow, so. Well, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it.